former girlfriend, Cassie Ventura, just wrapped up 4 days of powerful, grueling testimony in his federal sex trafficking and racketeering trial. Ventura spent close to 20 hours on the stand describing years of alleged abuse, including physical violence, sexual assault, and emotional control. The jury watched surveillance video from a 2016 hotel incident, first reported by CNN, where Combs is seen kicking and dragging Ventura in an elevator lobby. In a text sent days later, Ventura wrote to Combs, quote, "When you get effed up the wrong way, you always want to show me that you have the power. I'm not a rag doll. I'm someone's child." Ventura testified that she was living in fear, suffering from PTSD, and receiving trauma treatment years after the relationship ended. Under cross-examination, the defense questioned her timeline and her motives, pointing to mutual texts and meetings after the alleged abuse. But Ventura stood firm, telling the jury she didn't feel safe enough to say no. Combs faces charges including 2 counts of sex trafficking, 2 counts of transportation for prostitution, and racketeering conspiracy. He's denied all the allegations. Joining me now is CNN senior legal analyst and former assistant U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York, Elie Honig. Okay, Elie, before it began, you wrote and said it's overwhelmingly likely to end in a conviction, but it is not a cakewalk. Do you want to take any of that back now that we're into the trial?
No, I'm going to stick with that exactly, Michael. So I think the first part of that is overwhelmingly likely to result in conviction because we saw the evidence this week. I think Cassie Ventura was an extremely effective witness for the prosecution. I think she came across as credible and sympathetic and realistic in the way she described what happened to her. I think that video that we've been showing is incredibly compelling and visceral. But here's why it's not a cakewalk. The prosecutor's job here is not to prove that Sean Combs was a bad guy, a terrible guy. In fact, the defense got up and said he is a bad guy. He did commit domestic violence. But the charges here, the charges are the thing. This is not a state prosecution. This is not a domestic violence prosecution. This is a federal prosecution for racketeering, forcible sex trafficking, and then interstate prostitution. And I think as bad and damning as the evidence is, it's going to be tough for prosecutors, I think, to get it to meet the definition of racketeering and forcible sex trafficking.
Is there anything inherently illegal about a freak-off?
No, there's not. And look, the indictment sort of dwells on that. The freak-offs, of course, were these extended drug-fueled sex parties that Sean Combs would have along with Cassie Ventura, and they would bring in others. And I do think the indictment dwells on that a bit. I mean, the indictment lays out in detail what these freak-offs are, the recovery of the 1,000 bottles of baby oil, the fact that the participants used IV drips to rehydrate. But part of Sean Combs' defense was, A, it's not a crime to be a freak, in so many words, and B, they argue these were consensual. Now, the record is mixed on that. I mean, you showed some texts that show that indicate that Cassie Ventura was uncomfortable, did not want to participate in these sometimes, but there's other texts where she expresses positivity and enthusiasm for these. And so that's going to give the defense just enough of a thread to pull on to try to establish reasonable doubt.
Elie, we all have seen that video, first broadcast on CNN. You look at the beating that he's administering to her adjacent to a hotel, and you say, well, look at that. He's guilty. But he's not being charged with assault, right? Speak to that.
Exactly. First of all, that assault happened in 2016. So if this was a state-level prosecution for physical assault, for domestic violence, that had been brought within the statute of limitations, within 5 years of 2016, he'd be guilty in 2 seconds. They admitted that. The defense said that on a very unusual, but I think smart opening. Now, the question, though, is, well, what's the relevance? The prosecutors are saying this shows you that these freak-offs, that this sexual conduct was not voluntary, was not consensual, that it was only accomplished by the use of physical force. Sean Combs' counter-narrative is that this was a domestic dispute, that they were in a fight. He did wrong, they argue, the defense. It was a dispute because she had grabbed his phone. He was trying to get his phone back from her. And so, again, we have to keep in mind, is he bad? Is his conduct horrible? Yes. Does it meet the federal definition of sex trafficking by force and racketeering? That's more debatable.
Okay, and one final point, correct me if I'm wrong, but consent does not provide Diddy a defense here, but to the extent that they're seeking to show that she was a willing participant, it seems like they're just trying to make the whole situation and everybody involved part of some ugly enterprise and turn the jury off. Do I have it right?
Well, so 2 things. So on the sex trafficking charges, there's 2 variations of them. The more serious variation is by force, threats, or coercion. So if she consented, that would negate that. There's a less serious variation that's just interstate prostitution that carries a much lower penalty. To the larger point, the first count in this case is a racketeering conspiracy. I used to charge this all the time. Traditionally, that charge is used for mob families, for drug trafficking organizations. You can see it applied in other ways, but they need to show that Sean Combs was at the head of an organization, an organized group that committed multiple interconnected crimes for a common purpose. And I don't think Cassie Ventura's testimony on its own gets prosecutors there, but this is what I'm looking for in the coming weeks. I think they're going to build this out. I think they're going to show that this was not just a troubled domestic relationship, but prosecutors are going to try to show that this was a larger pattern of organized activity. I think it's going to be tough. I think they're going to have a hard time making out that racketeering charge, but I do think they've introduced some powerful evidence that can set them on their way towards it.
I'm going to put a social media up and we'll explore it together, but I want to say something. Criminal enterprise, he's the only one at the table. Enterprise with whom?
Yeah. Look, it's a good point. Technically, you can have a racketeering enterprise of one. It is not ideal. I mean, when I charged federal racketeering cases, the fewest defendants I ever had was maybe 5 or 6. I had 25 defendant cases, and I think count on the defense trying to exploit that. They're going to say, folks, they're trying to build this up into more than it is. It was a troubled domestic
they've overcharged
relationship, and they're trying to make him a RICO of one. Yeah.
Okay, real quick. Here's that social media. I'll read it out loud. Listening to all the reporting so far on this trial, and I'm no lawyer, but I don't hear the RICO charges coming out, at least so far. That's pretty much what you were just saying. I certainly see that Combs is a bad guy who treats women like objects and is probably misogynistic. Lots of adjectives we could use. But where's the RICO? Give me just 20 seconds on that, Ellie.
I agree. If the verdict had to be rendered today on RICO, he's not guilty. However, stay tuned, because this is the task now for prosecutors. They have to call other witnesses. They have to establish there was some element of organization here. That's the challenge.
Ellie, excellent as always. Thank you so much.